Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm going to dive into the settlement agreement between Market Surveillance Administrator and the Balancing Pool. And I'd just like to establish exactly what it is the Balancing Pool has agreed the rules that they contravened. So I'm reading the settlement agreement here. Paragraph 42 says the Balancing Pool should have acted to stem its losses by terminating the unprofitable PPAs as soon as possible. Paragraph 43 says, in part, Balancing Pool did not manage the generation assets comprised of the terminated PPAs in a commercial manner. What is the implication of that, Mr. Chappell? What is the implication of not managing generation assets of the terminated PPAs in a commercial manner?
Well, as I said earlier, the Balancing Pool did not want to move forward with the termination of the PPAs, given that the matter was being contested in the courts. We felt that was prudent and reasonable, given the circumstances and given the severity of the decision. That said, we recognize the concerns that were raised by the MSA in their investigation, and we've agreed to report on our commercial activities in managing those PPAs on a go-forward basis to add clarity and transparency to the matter.
Can you provide us with a calculation of what the differential in cost to Albertans in all forms, either that be through borrowed money or impact on electricity bills for consumers, what the difference is had you, in fact, acted in a commercial manner as the MSA found you should have?
That's actually a very difficult question. When we conducted our PPA termination consultations with consumer groups, there were varied opinions about the impact of terminating the PPAs in terms of the costs to consumers. We had consumer groups who were supportive of the PPA terminations, and we had consumer groups who advocated that the PPA terminations should not proceed. And we had consumer groups who advocated that, or who took a more neutral position. So the impact on consumers depends on your assumptions about market circumstances, depends on the timing, and presumably the consumer groups varied in their opinions about the PPA terminations due to their specific circumstances.
But the MSA found that you acted inappropriately. You should have terminated them earlier. So can you not calculate what would have happened had you terminated, regardless of the opinion of consumer groups, had you terminated in 2016 when the PPAs were returned versus when you did in fact terminate in 2017-18?
Well, again, it would be a very difficult exercise to proceed with. Just as way of background here, when the Balancing Pool terminates a PPA, the control of the underlying assets, the generation assets, revert back to the PPA owner. The PPA owner is then faced with a few choices. The PPA owner may choose to shut down the facilities. That in itself would have an impact on the market and market prices. If the PPA owner decided to continue to run the plants, how they operated the plants in the market would have implications for power prices. To the extent that the choices of the PPA owner affected power prices in a positive way, as in an upward way, that would benefit the Balancing Pool's remaining position that it had in the market. Which creates a very difficult interplay to figure out between the Balancing Pool's actions, the owner's actions, and market circumstances at the time. And this is why we had consumer groups that were arguing for the PPA terminations and against. Many consumer groups actually felt that they would be benefited if the PPA terminations did not proceed.
So what I want to dig into is how is it that the board of the Balancing Pool ultimately decided to pursue legal action versus simply terminating the PPAs when, in the end of the day, the MSA has found that the right thing to do would have been to terminate those PPAs? Is it fair to say there was some disagreement there? Are the same board members today that were board members then that made that decision?
One is. And
how many total board members?
We have 5 total right now.
So 4 of those board members are no longer board members?
No, sorry, to clarify, 1 board member was sitting throughout the entire period that the PPA termination issue went on.
Thank you very much. Again, I'm going to pick up where I left off with Mr. Chappell. And I won't expect you to comment on what I'm going to say here, but I have to say there's some pretty odd behavior, and I won't expect you to comment on why we've had multiple board resignations from the Balancing Pool, but it really is pretty remarkable behavior for what is supposed to be an independent body of the government of Alberta. So if I can break this down in a way that is a very complex issue, and I've got to say this complexity seems to be used to mask what sure appear to be some real problems. So in a simple sense, PPAs were handed back to the balancing pool as a result of government policy choices which rendered them more unprofitable. The balancing pool accepted that first PPA back, which tells me that the balancing pool knew at the time that was the right thing to do. But the government of Alberta sues, which causes a 2-year delay, hundreds of millions of dollars in losses, taking what was a positive $700 million in the bank for the balancing pool to a negative $800 million, and probably counting, based on my understanding of financial statements going forward. Then one government agency investigates another government agency and finds that what we think we knew all along, that it was in fact behaving in a non-commercial manner to push back and sue and instead of just accepting back the PPAs. And all I can conclude is there must have been a tremendous amount of pressure to do that. I mean, the people in the balancing pool are a rare breed of people who are expert in a very, very specialized field. So it seems to be very odd behavior. When I come back to the settlement agreement between the MSA and the balancing pool, I look at paragraph 67, and it says, the circumstances that arose here were unprecedented and unexpected. I just have to ask, Mr. Chappell, was there political pressure from anyone, anywhere in the government of Alberta for you to behave the way you did?
That's a great question, actually. By way of background again, it's important to differentiate where interaction with government is required and where it's not. So there are a number of legislative and regulatory pieces that require the balancing pool to interact with government. For example, under the Alberta Public Agencies Governance Act, the balancing pool as a government agency is required to share information with government. Under Section 97 of the Electric Utilities Act, the balancing pool is required to consult with the minister before proceeding with a PPA termination. So this framework exists, and the balancing pool did fulfill its legal obligations to have those interactions with government. Outside of those interactions, though, there was no pressure from government or no direction from government to delay the process. The balancing pool took into account that there was an action in front of the courts that contested the very premise on which these PPAs had been returned to the balancing pool, and based on legal advice received, felt that it would be most prudent to not move forward with these permanent and irreversible PPA terminations until that matter had been settled.
But with respect, that's been proven to be demonstrably incorrect, to a tremendous cost of the people of Alberta ultimately are now on the hook for the money that's been borrowed. Do you acknowledge that was a mistake then to go down this path?
Well, like I said, that was a decision that was made at the time with the information that was available, and I do believe it was a prudent and responsible decision. But that said, the balancing pool acknowledges the concerns that were raised by the MSA in its investigation, and we've agreed to the reporting requirements going forward to add more transparency and clarity to the matter going forward.
Do you have the independence you need to do your job in the balancing pool?
Yes, we do.
Is the system set up in its optimal way? I mean, we have these groups that are arm's length to some degree. It seems the MSA has total independence, but the balancing pool has this odd legislative touch point, I guess, with government, which seems to open a pretty big avenue for the risk of political interference. Is the system designed optimally?
Good, thank you, sir. Would you mind responding to that in writing?
Certainly.
Thank you, sir.
Ask please to table any advice by the balancing pool to the government of Alberta between the date of the commencement of legal action on July 25th, 2016 and the conclusion of legal action on or before December 31st, 2017.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Mr. Hunter?
Difference between what would have happened had PPAs been cancelled in 2016 versus the actual cancellation date 2018.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Mr.